I love you more than heroin. Find out why this statement has value as we are joined by Elizabeth Snyder from Reflections Recovery Center. She talks about recovery, depth psychology, existentialism, shame, support networks, chaos, and the value of slowing down. Your way doesn't work. You don't know what you're doing? Listen to other people. She was told as she got into recovery. She has continued to open up, learn, and connect in her own recovery and as a professional. Enjoy. Welcome to the Illuminate Recovery Podcast. We shed light on mental health issues, mental illness, and addiction recovery, ways to cope, manage, and inspire. Beyond the self-care we will discuss, you may need the help of a licensed professional. My name's Kurt Snyder. I'm a husband, a father, entrepreneur, a handyman, and a student of life. I avoid conflict, I deflect with humor, and I'm fascinated by the human experience.
And I'm Shelley Mangum. I am a clinical mental health counselor, and my favorite role of all times is grandma. I am a seeker of truth, and I feel like life should be approached with tremendous curiosity.
I ask the dumb questions.
I fill in the gaps.
Hey Liz, it's so great to have you with us. We have today Elizabeth Snyder. She's with us and can't tell you how excited. Elizabeth has just a tremendous passion for this industry and she's shared a few things with me along the way that I'm super curious to learn more about. So welcome Liz, and thanks for sharing your insights with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited.
So there was one thing that you had said as you've come on quite a journey, and maybe you can talk just a little bit about your journey. You talked about your Buddhist background, kind of the Buddhist mentality that drives some of your thinking and thought processes. I wonder if you could share some of that with us.
Oh yeah, for sure. The history of it kind of pertains to my whole recovery process too. I was first introduced to Buddhism, I think when I was like 14. My brother gave me a book by Thich Nhat Hanh. I read it, didn't think much on it, just like, okay, I like this. Kind of dabbled in it a little bit, just because I don't refer to myself as a practicing Buddhist, but I studied the philosophy and like how it applies to psychoanalysis. So it wasn't until I got back into college that I really delved into it more. I think it was my sophomore year. I took a class called Thinking, Knowing, and Being, not realizing that this was a senior level class. And I was like maybe a year sober. So I'm in this class and it's on Indian thought and phenomenology and how Heideggerian theory, Heidegger is a philosopher. So that is really what introduced me into it. And my professor at the time, Wayne Hanowicz, wonderful man, just kind of grabbed me as like, you have a thing for this. You need to get more into this, and it kind of flourished from there that I really started getting into the theory of it and how it applied to addiction or how you could use it to treat addiction and mental health, which really led to a lot of my research too within addiction and grief and mental health and all these other things.
That's very cool. I know this was the terminology that you used was the phenomenology and the existentialism.
Yes.
Can you define that a little bit? What does that mean?
So existentialism, at least how I have viewed it and in my research and studies, has been like, what is your purpose? Where do you get your identity from, your sense of being, like capital B being, like who is it that you are and for what purpose, what drives you in your life? And the phenomenology is, it's all those interesting parts that we see unfolding in our lives, like the stories and the narration and how that ties to our sense of being and purpose and how that relates to others. So that's really how I've approached phenomenology and existentialism, is kind of these two things that interlock with each other to explain existence.
Very cool. And I too, I love the existentialism and that framework, right, of what makes us tick, what's really in our center and our core, which also leads to that idea that you mentioned that you'd really like to see depth psychology become more of a practice. So talk about what is depth psychology.
So depth psychology, at least this is how I viewed it. I mean, I'm somewhat biased because I've had these mentors in my life where I've kind of clung to them and kind of explored their interests, but realized like our interests are a lot of the same. So depth psychology, from my understanding of it, at least, because we see that people come into therapy or they come into treatment and it's this quick fix. Like an outpatient, the understanding is like, we'll have them for 90 days. Or if you go to individual therapy, it's like, we'll go in, get fixed in 10 sessions. That's not enough time because these things that we're going to treatment for or for therapy for are really fascinating and nuanced, and they're going to take some time to delve into. So I wish that there could be more attention put to those things, to really wonder and ask why and get into the trauma and get into the codependent relationships or whatever those dynamics are and really unravel them, which that's going to take longer than a couple months. It might take years, or it might take a year and you'll have a break and then you'll come back in another year, because human life it's hard. And to think that we're going to have this quick fix is just, I think it's really silly, but that's kind of how the insurance companies have kind of pushed it and how it's just come to be understood of like, go in, get out, you're done.
Yeah, which is challenging because some people, we're talking about the kind of, and talk a little bit about the treatment program that you do and the level of acuity that you see people come in with. Because my perspective is I look at life as it's a journey, and we are all on that journey of healing. And you could call it recovery, but I don't think that's exclusive to just people that go into a facility or into treatment for substance abuse or mental health. I believe, those have higher acuities, but we're all on a journey, right? And if we are never able to get to a place where we feel heard and seen and understood, not only by ourselves but by others, then we really haven't found that place of love and belonging and healing, right? And so talk a little bit about where you work, what kind of acuity you see coming into it, and how some of these ideas that you have, these approaches, how you really see them having a positive impact on these people.
Yeah. So I run Reflections Outpatient, so it's an outpatient dual diagnosis substance abuse and mental health treatment program. Majority of our clients, it's primary substance abuse, and it's really rare when we will have people come in that don't also have a mental health diagnosis, because usually that mental health diagnosis is there first, but we're treating the substance abuse because it's essentially like flaring up the most right now, because you'll abuse substances to cope with your mental health issues. So what we see with our clients, that's kind of been the trend, we've been open for about 3 years now, is, they come in and we tell them like it's a minimum, absolute minimum 90 days. If we say 90 days, it's like, oh, cool, I'm done in 90 days. Our average is about 5 to 6 months. But even then, I feel like that's not long enough, because it's usually by about month 3, they're finally open, like, okay, I need to get into my trauma, or I need to get into my mental health disorders. And then it's kind of like this rush thing of like, well, do we get into the trauma and these issues when you're going to be graduating soon? Because that's just going to open up all these wounds, and then we pass you off when we don't see you. So we've been really doing a much better job of really taking those things into consideration a lot sooner in our program. Of if we know if someone has trauma or mental health, we're upfront with them, like, you might have a longer stay here, because if we get into the trauma and the mental health, it might drudge up some cravings and some triggers, and can sometimes lead to relapses. That's something that we understand. But yeah, to even 90 days, and that's kind of the understanding for outpatient programs, is not enough time. And especially at our program, we utilize couple sessions and family sessions, and we'll do co-therapy, where quite a few of our clients will have 2 therapists, sometimes in the room at the same time, or they'll rotate, or 2 different therapists for 2 separate sessions within the same week, which that's a lot to get into and to unravel in just 90 days. It's not possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if you consider somebody's primary, they're coming in on substance abuse, and that is their most acute, right? That's the thing you have to address first, because it's life threatening.
Yeah.
And so we address their, they have to detox, and they're, 30 days before the fog leaves, and they can really start to function mentally and start to shift some of those thought processes and all of that. And now you're already 30 days into it, right?
Yeah.
So then you just have this short period of time, and if they get 90 days, which is rare even now, right? If you get 30 days, you're lucky as a residential level of care, and then you've got to do your outpatient, which there's value to that. But but they've got to be, I mean, how long do you see people really, the successful people that really can engage in recovery and sustain that recovery, how long do they engage in treatment?
So it used to be, and I miss this, I miss when residential treatment was 90 days. Because when I went through treatment, that was the norm. Because like you said, that first 30 days, you're just getting stable, you're detoxing, and then you're ready to, you get your cognitive functioning back. So with inpatient now being about, 30 days, maximum 45, and then transitioning to outpatient, for those that we have successfully complete the program inpatient to outpatient fully, you're looking at about 6 to 7 months of treatment, but that is a fight with the insurance companies, but it's also, to really get into, like I mentioned, the trauma and the mental health or relationships they're having with peers in treatment, codependency, and there's so many different things that can get drudged up and flare up and get compounded and all combined. About 6-7 months, I would say, is our average for those that fully complete it and then maintain in our aftercare program also.
Yeah, it's and I really think that it should be a year-long program, right? I mean, we have much better understanding now, really great tools that we have for helping to resolve that trauma, and but still, it takes time to reprocess the way it's stored in the brain. It takes time to make those shifts and find safety and find those support networks that are needed. And so, yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly that it just takes more time. I'm wondering if you could share with us maybe some of your recovery, as much of it or as little of it as you'd like, but some, in the midst of that, some of your biggest failures or setbacks, maybe your biggest one and kind of how you approach that.
Yeah, so my recovery story, I'll just give kind of the quick summary of it. So I was a polysubstance addict. Primary drug of choice was heroin, though, but I did everything other than meth. Somehow I did not come across meth, and I did not see it until a week I went into residential treatment. But, everything else, I was doing all of it. I went through individual therapy, in and out of therapists, methadone clinics, being prescribed methadone from just primary doctors, not at a clinic, because I couldn't afford methadone treatment at a clinic. I would say probably my biggest failure that still stands out to me in my recovery process was there was a moment, I think it was in, I want to say 2011, where I had some friends that knew I was using. They're like, we're telling your parents. So they drove me to my parents, and I completely freaked out. I was drunk, I was on heroin, and I had a prescription of Ambien at the time, and I was just done. So I took the whole bottle of Ambien and had an active suicide attempt, where my dad was on the phone with the cops, calling an ambulance, while I was sitting there in this fit of anger, just kicking my sweet little dad. That to me was my biggest failure of how bad it actually was, and that I wasn't able to really see it because I didn't get into recovery until years later, a couple years after that fact. It still took some time, but that was a really big moment when I still look back on it. That is how bad it really gets. And that's our norm for those of us in recovery. These stories of horror and trauma and fighting with family, it's normal. It's our average.
It's so hard because you work so hard to try and cope and manage, right? And what I find is really interesting, and maybe it's not funny, but there is a humor piece to it, is people who are actively in their addiction often think that they're managing really well and that nobody knows they're struggling with addiction, and it's kind of humorous because everybody knows.
Everyone. Yep. I think we're hiding it so well, and that's never the case.
But you really do believe that you are, and so there's that, that lack of awareness, and the drugs and that influence on the brain is really what does that.
Yeah.
One thing that you probably have some insight on, you tell me, is that really active use of a substance tends to change, and I think of Maslow's hierarchy, right? It tends to change the most important things in your life, to where that drug becomes the most important. Do you see that happening a lot?
Oh, yes. Yep. I Actually, a funny little anecdote that's happened over this last weekend that reminded me of this. I was talking with my sister. She's seeing a new doctor, and her doctor was just chatting with her, hanging out, and mentioned that he's in recovery too, and his drug of choice was heroin. And my sister was like, it was weird that he was telling me this, right? But I shared with him, and I said, like, oh yeah, my sister's in recovery too. She once told me that she loves me more than heroin. And the doctor just said, like, oh my gosh, your sister loves you so much because heroin is great. And just that alone is like, yeah, that's because our drugs, it becomes everything because we're trying to numb out. It becomes our coping skill. It becomes this romance where you are in love with it and in this really dynamic relationship with it where it is your everything. It holds your hope. It holds your desire. It also holds your downfalls. That, active use, it's a romance. It's a really sad romance story.
Well, and it rewires your brain. It's not like you chose that to happen. That's just part of the chemical reaction that goes on in addiction, right? It's part of that addictive pattern. As eventually that drug becomes more important than every relationship you have, even the most important relationships, which is why relationships are so hard. And we talk about them in, you talk about them, family therapy and relationships and couple therapy, because it does a lot of damage, and it just rewires that brain to where it becomes more important than food, than clothing, than shelter. The drug is the most important thing, and you will do anything to get that drug. And some people are like, what's wrong with them? Why can't they choose not to do that? And it's not a choice at that point, right?
Yeah.
It's
a survival instinct at that point, because it's like you said, like it's more important than food and shelter. It's one thing, like we'll use these substances to cope with whatever it is that we're coping with, and then you become dependent on it. And like you said, there isn't a choice at that point because you're dependent on it, because without it, you're going to get so sick, which withdrawals I would not wish upon my worst enemy, because it's hellish. It's terrible. And just to stave that off alone is like, yes, it's going to be more important than food and shelter in your relationships, because the pain of going through those withdrawals is horrendous.
Oh, which is in the back of your mind always when you're using, I imagine.
Yeah.
Oh. So talk for a little bit, and I love that you shared your story, some of your story, right, and some of that journey. And for you, it's real. It's like this is who you are. This is part of your story, and so often we carry shame with our story, that somehow there's something inherently wrong with us. Do you have thoughts around that piece?
Yeah, it's something that I've actively lived too, because I grew up in a family where shame was never imposed on us. And granted, I had a pretty messed up family. Like, I have a brother that was in active use, died from a heroin overdose a few years ago. Another brother that was smoking marijuana and taking acid all throughout high school. Just really dysfunctional family. Like, my dad went to prison for a couple of years. But throughout all that, a lesson that my dad taught us, because he went to prison, like that's one of the worst things that can happen to someone. He never talked about it with shame. Yes, there was some guilt there and some concern and just some some years lost, but never shame about it. So even when I was in my active use, and my brother too, and my other siblings, whatever we were going through, yes, there was some disappointment, but I never felt shamed, oddly enough. And so I've tried to really live that, and something I found in recovery is, to validate without enabling, to not impose shame, to not impose guilt, because that's not going to do any good. It's going to worsen the problem. Granted, over the years when I was in active use, there was some moments of shame, but it was more out of frustration from my family of just not knowing what to do. So it's, as a family member, you try anything, any type of intervention or any kind of discussion you're possibly going to, just to get something through. But I've never felt shame about my addiction, and I've never viewed it as something shameful, because it's a way that people cope. And when you've gone through something that has led you to abuse substances to cope, that's not that person's fault. And like you said too, at one point it becomes a choice where you can't stop. And so to impose shame on someone when they can't stop something, that's not going to do any good. You need to talk to them about it. You need to validate it, have them be heard, and get to unravel and get all those words out so it's not weighing them down anymore.
That's profound. It's so profound. And, well, and it was pretty remarkable that you didn't experience more shame, because families often not knowing and not understanding what addiction is and how it works, how often do you hear the words, what's wrong with you, and why can't you just stop, right?
Yeah.
It's not that easy. It just can't be that easy. And so that openness of, we accept everything here, right? And we're going to look at this and we're going to dive deep. I love your idea that everybody's story is so remarkable and so incredible, regardless of what it is, that when we can dive down into it, the things that we learn from them and that they learn about themselves, that's where the healing happens, right? It's really understanding. And I know I was told once, I'm a clinical mental health counselor, and I was told once that you're not supposed to ask why questions. Like, what do you mean? Like, what do you mean? My whole life is asking why. Like, explain this to me. Help me understand this. And so I just have to ask it in a different way. I can't say why, because some people think that when you say why, you're asking them why they're doing that because they're doing something wrong, right? They're doing something wrong. You send that message, and I'm like, I would never send that message. I just want to understand. I need to know, right? I got to know how this works. So I love that piece. I'm curious, because recovery is not a solo activity. So what was your support network? Who were your mentors along the way? Not just in recovery too, but recovery, and then moving on to wanting to get into recovery and working in recovery and helping others.
Yeah. So when I first got into recovery, I did a month of inpatient treatment because I was private pay too. I was not doing longer than a month. Didn't want to be there, but those last couple weeks really benefited me. But yeah, I did a month of treatment. But for a year after that, I attended aftercare, which was something that the facility I went to offered free of charge. And I made it a point to be there every single Tuesday night. And I rode the bus there, and it was not close. It was about an hour and a half on the bus every week to get there and back. So for a while, that was my support system, because, I was told in treatment, your way doesn't work. You don't know what you're doing. Listen to other people. And I was told to do aftercare. It's like, all right, I'm doing aftercare. So from aftercare, I did that for a while, and then as I transitioned out of that, there was steps before that too. So when I was about 9 months sober, I enrolled back into school. I had previously flunked out. I was on academic probation because, I was a flight risk to leave school again and just not show up. But getting back into school, I remember meeting with my academic advisor, and I was fully honest about what I was going through, that I was terrified. I was 9 months sober. I didn't know what classes I was supposed to take. I had somehow messed up my scheduling, and I was scheduled for 2 classes at the same time. So with her help of taking my classes, getting them moved around where they needed to be and hearing a little bit of my story, it was, okay, I'm going to transfer you into Psychology 1010. You need to be in Matthew Draper's class. Didn't know who this man was. She transferred me into his class, and Matthew Draper has been my mentor ever since then. That was in 2013 that I went to school. I've studied under him. I've taken all of his classes. He's a phenomenal man. He pushed me to do research too. Like in my freshman year, I had to do a research paper, just like a practice one for a class. He's like, well, do it. How about you do it on the comorbidity rates of adolescents with eating disorders, self-harm, and substance abuse? Like, I don't know what this is. I'm a freshman. But he taught me, and he held a research group weekly. A lot of my research I've done with him. Like, I still work with him to this day. I've devised curriculum with him. I was an instructional assistant for him. I taught classes for him. And now he's the clinical director at our program. So I'm in the program director position. He's clinical director. So we're still buddied up. So as I transitioned out of aftercare, I kind of switched to like school. That I had created this new life. I didn't know anyone, but with Matthew Draper taking me under his wing, it's like I have this whole new world. This is a recovery program too. It's not 12 steps, sure. It's not, going to meetings weekly, but it was a new environment that fostered learning and creativity, and that to me is what recovery is. It's that creativity of how you're going to cope and how you're going to manage and find out what your passions are. Which I know, like most people, they do. They go to 12 steps, they get a sponsor. That was not my route at all. I did do 90 meetings in 90 days, and I attended a home group for about a year, and I gave it a good shot. It's like, this just isn't for me. But school, that was where I transitioned everything to. And, like I've mentioned, my studies and all my research, it's focused around addiction and recovery, which I do not recommend, of making recovery your life and thinking like, oh, that's going to be how I'm going to maintain my recovery. That's not how it works. I had to really supplement other things into that, like how to take care of myself and be aware of my triggers and how to decompress and find people to vent with, which is a whole nother side to that. So I did aftercare, got into school, found Matt Draper, was mentored under him, and really just thrived in a school environment. And that is kind of where I maintained and found my passion for recovery.
That's an incredible story, and that's the thing is, recovery for every individual is different. And so to say that you have to fit some mold and you have to go to aftercare and you have to go to AA which all are powerful things, but it might not be what works for you, but there is something out there that works for you, because there's so many options. You've got to find what's going to work for you, and you might need help doing that, which still comes back to your idea of digging deep, that depth psychology of helping them really understand who they are at the core, because how often do they really not really have a handle on that? Well, and you touched on the trauma too. When trauma is the underlying piece that's driving, the survival mechanisms, that's driving the escape and the drug use and all of that, you got to go look at that piece, and that's not a short period of time.
Yeah.
You talked about the fact that I think that you have some trauma underlying for your addiction that was driving that, and I'm assuming you're still working on that.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, it's an ongoing process. Like, even I found over the years, like, getting into relationships, like I'm married now, and I have found too that with my spouse now, even being the stable, safe relationship has brought up some trauma, and I've had to communicate with him like, this is just my own neuroses. I feel like you're going to leave me. And this is why, because you're sticking with me. And this is so strange to me, because my past is filled with people leaving me because I was either dysfunctional in my mental health or my substance abuse. So even stability has dredged up trauma. And I think that's something that also gets overlooked, that when you get in healthy relationships, you're still going to have some neurotic behaviors come out that you're going to have to learn to cope with along the way.
Right, but I love that you're able to have that communication, right? You talk about it and you speak to it and you say, look, this is what's coming up for me. This is the story I tell myself right now, and be out in the open. I always love the analogy of when you put things in the light, that they can't stay in the darkness, and they have to, you have to be able to work with them and be able to uncover them. And so I love shining light on things by talking about them with people who deserve to hear your story.
Yeah.
Not everybody deserves that.
Yes.
Okay, so here's a question that I always think is a little bit interesting is, do you think that everyone needs recovery?
Yes and no. I'm very good at not giving straight answers to questions like this. The reason why yes and no, because recovery, and I'm sure you know this, if people aren't ready, it's not going to work. So if we were to say, like, yes, like, everyone needs recovery, doesn't matter what it's for, but if they're not ready, then what's the point? So until that person is ready to get into recovery, if it's for trauma, even if it's for things like gambling or overeating, whatever it is, these nitty-gritty things to get into, when we think of recovery, we think only substance abuse. But it can be for absolutely anything and everything when that person's ready for it and ready to really start to delve in and be like, oh, I might have a problem with this one thing that, I have a compulsion to, or I have a dependence to. But until someone's ready, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, great point. Not everybody's ready for it. We might all need it, but we may not all be open to it. And that's right. Even the first step is that we have to acknowledge that there's something wrong. We have to see that there's actually a problem, and we're so busy, denial. Denial is a beautiful, blissful thing, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It doesn't help us at all, but we live in that space because it's safe and we can protect ourselves. So, yeah, you have to have, those experiences and sometimes it takes help from others to, like, I know you think you're doing okay, but you're not doing okay, and let's get you some help,
Yep.
Oh, craziness. It's fun to... What's the greatest, and I'll just ask this question, what's What do you love about this industry and what you do?
I love the chaos of it. When I was in active use, that was something that I loved. Like, I was a con artist. Like, I was dealing drugs. I was conning family members. I was conning friends. I was conning drug dealers. But it was that chaos of everything. I've always been drawn to that, even as a child. Just, I was always out running around, not being where I was supposed to be, worrying my parents, like, where's Elizabeth? And getting into recovery and working in this field, it is chaotic. Because you're helping people that are now at those starting stages of maybe they're detoxing, or they're realizing they have a problem, or they're not open to realizing that they might have a problem, and it's messy. It is so messy, and especially adding the business side of it that I'm now getting involved in too. Oh, I love it, because it's redefining that chaos for a greater good. Like I've always said too, that when I was conning people in my manipulation, I was very good at it, that I found a way to use my manipulation and that conning for good. I mean, like, heck, like, look at insurance companies, like, doing utilization reviews. It's all kind of manipulation of trying to justify why someone needs treatment when an insurance company might not want to pay. So it's using those skills for good now. That chaos and just the mess of it all, I love it. Because, you know, we'll have 30 clients at a time, and they're all coming in with all these different issues, and it's so messy to keep organized and make sure they're attending their groups and meeting with their individual therapists and then consulting with the therapist and the case managers. I love it.
That's fantastic, because it's chaotic, and you know, people are rigid, or they're chaotic in these spaces, or they're a little bit of both, and I love the way you kind of embrace that and go, let's work with that. Let's figure out how to make that a strength. And insurance companies want to know what's wrong with somebody. Why can't they function? And the chaos is a perfect way to describe that in your notes, right? So what a great way to show dysfunction at the same time of utilizing those pieces. I often have people, you know, that I've worked with in treatment, and I always look at them and go, what's your strength? Like, you know, you were a pretty successful drug dealer, and you were pretty successful at manipulating people and talking to people and conning them, and okay, these are strengths. Let's figure out how to, just like you said, let's figure out how to put them into a positive spin and into a useful purpose, and now look at all these strengths that you have, right?
Yeah.
I mean, these are some of the highest functioning, amazing people that I've ever met are the ones in recovery, and I'm just like, I love these people. They're incredible. And they have so much to teach me. And so for me as a therapist, it's kind of like, you know, I'm here to learn just as much as you are. Let's figure out what works for you. There's not one path. There's not one way.
Yeah.
Which I love your uniqueness in that. To the listeners out there, what's your piece of advice? Do you have something that you know you would recommend to everybody that would be helpful?
I think my biggest piece of advice would be to slow down, to take your time. Because, you know, like I've said that I feel like everyone's story is the greatest story ever told, and to enjoy that while we're going through our lives, no matter what it is. Like, if it is, you know, pain and the suffering that we're going through, sit with it. Slow down and really get to know why it is, you know, that maybe you wake up one morning sobbing, or that one day is filled with this extreme amount of joy because you've had an accomplishment. Like, to really wonder about those things and just slow down. So I think a lot of people, and I get caught up in this too, of trying to define everything and have these expectations. And for me, at least, that has always caused this, like, clinging to something, which just causes me to worry more and have more anxiety. But when I slow down and just, it is what it is, and I'm here, and let's see what happens today. You know, that old saying in the rooms of AA and NA, like, one day at a time. You know, which is, I don't do 12 steps, but I love that because it's true. Just take it one day at a time, slow it down, wonder about it, and just think, figure it out. And if you can't figure it out, ask people, you know, involve other people and get that connection and those conversations going. Because everyone's story is the greatest story ever told. And when you include other people into your story, you're learning pieces of their story and they're learning pieces of yours. And that's really beautiful.
I love that comment that everybody's story is the greatest story that was ever told. I could not agree with that more. And it's a way of putting it in perspective is, let's hear your story. It's incredible. And tell me more, right? What else is under all of that? And so I love that advice. That's very, very well, very profound, and I think it applies to everybody.
Yeah.
Everybody. You don't have to be in recovery. You don't have to have an addiction or have dealt with an addiction or anything, right, to have a tremendous, incredible story. I've heard lots of people go, you don't want to hear about my story, it's just boring, it's whatever. No.
Yeah.
I love that. Do you want to share anything about Reflections as far as a recovery program and, maybe put in a plug for what they do?
Oh, yeah. So we have a residential and an outpatient facility really close to each other, too, like 2 blocks from each other, which is, I love being that close. So our residential program, it's minimum, 30 days, 45 days, but the team they have over there is so beautiful. Like, we have a couple case managers that go between the 2 facilities, and just that we offer that little bit of continuity of care of people going between the 2 facilities has really helped our facility kind of stand out, because we know what's going on at both places, because it is hard to have people at both facilities. So if we can just have a couple select that do that. But our residential facility too, it's smaller too, which I love that they keep it small. The maximum they can have over there is 16 clients. Because I've been to other facilities where they have, even when you get close to 20, that's too many people. To run a process group with 20 people is insanity to me, because how is everyone going to have their voice heard? So the fact that they keep that house a smaller house, I absolutely love, because it gives attention and detail to every single client for whatever their needs are. In our outpatient program, I work there, I run the program. I can't say enough good about it. We have had a beautiful team over here that has been the same team for about 2 years now, where I can't say enough good about it too. Is our clinical director right now, he was 1 day a week, so we have a very part-time clinical director, and that we are still running as smoothly and as beautifully as we are with a clinical director that's only here 1 day a week, I think really shows how strong our team is. That we all have the understanding that if you're in the building and a decision needs to be made and you're the therapist, it defers to you. If you don't know, you're going to go grab myself, or you're going to go grab the office manager. That we really consult with each other constantly to help our clients. And we have a really fun team. Like, our doors are always open. We're always hanging out with each other. And I think this is the same at residential too. I'm just not over there, so I don't know. But a lot of the same attitudes and beliefs are reflected at both facilities, so I'm going to assume that they have the same kind of mindset they have over there as we do here. I love our team because the personalities of everyone, and we're friends too, but we're also good enough friends that we will kick each other's asses if we have to, that we will call each other out of, like, you really messed up on holding this boundary, and here's how you can improve on it, that we have that open relationship with each other so we can model that to our clients. Because they look up to us. I've had clients tell us all the time, like, you guys know that we look up to you like idols. Like, okay, there's some pressure, but, we're doing the best that we can. And the fact that the majority of our staff is in recovery too, and that we're living this and offering treatment to these people so they can learn from us and we can learn from them is, that's kind of the overall view of our program. But it's the people that work here and the clients we serve is the biggest part.
That's incredible, and I agree. If you haven't done your own work and you can't model those healthy patterns, then how in the world are you think that you're going to teach that to somebody else? You got to do the work. You're going to be able to serve and help other people. So I totally endorse that. That's incredible. And if people want to get a hold of you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Best way is probably by phone, probably my cell phone number actually, because I use that as like the way to schedule all the intakes and kind of go over the admission process, because I do work quite a bit from home because calls come in, and that's when I address them. So my cell phone number, people can contact me on that. It's 801-796-2620, or by email too, so it's pretty simple, liz@rrcutah.com. Our Google listing is also finally up and running. Took 2 years. But if people want to look us up on Google, just Google Reflections Recovery Center Outpatient. And for residential, just Reflections Recovery Center. And both, what's nice about our listing is they really overlap too, which is convenient.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. That's fantastic. Liz, I could talk to you for hours, and I love that you were willing to come and share some of your your insight. I would love to get with you, later and talk more in depth about some of the research that you've done and some of your findings, which I think are absolutely fascinating. Thanks for sharing what you have, and we'll probably have to have you on the show again sometime.
Okay, yeah, thank you for having me. This was a joy to do.